Smoke hung in the air like a bad decision at a cheap bar. Captain Van Asher grunted as he kicked open the door to the archive, the metal groaning in protest. "Of course," he muttered, "the one building not protected by the Galactic Insurance Plan." Flames licked at the edges of ancient data tablets, and the fire suppression system was as useful as a solar-powered torch in a blackout. Ven was a man who thrived in chaos, mostly because he'd been married once. His ex-wife had taught him the valuable lesson of expecting everything to go wrong and still finding a way to blame it on him. He was a veteran now, hardened by years of bureaucratic incompetence and enough combat to last several lifetimes, or at least one particularly unlucky cat. "Cap, we gotta move," his lieutenant, Drax, yelled over the roar of the flames, his voice as subtle as a rampaging rhino. Drax was built like a tank and had the brains to match, though his heart was in the right place. If only he could locate it under all that muscle. "Yeah, yeah," Ven replied, waving a dismissive hand as he surveyed the chaos. The Galactic Archive was less a repository of knowledge now and more a barbecue for books. "Grab what you can. We need that data before it turns into cosmic dust." Drax nodded and dove into the blaze, emerging moments later, clutching a handful of chips, their surfaces glinting with the promise of untapped history and questionable budgeting decisions. Ven pocketed a few himself, the heat blistering his fingers through the worn fabric of his gloves. "Tell me again why we're risking our necks for this crap." "Orders from the top," Drax grunted, sweat pouring down his face like the waterfall of regret that often followed a night out with Ven. "Apparently this stuff's got the secret to, not dying in the future." Future insurance," Ven chuckled, dodging a falling beam. "Just what I always wanted." The fire was spreading faster than a nasty rumor, and Ven had the distinct feeling that if he didn't move his ass, he'd be as crispy as the data he was trying to save. Meanwhile, light years away and in a setting as calm as a politician's promise, a group of alien diplomats, or so they appeared, lounged in an opulent office, sipping something blue and probably toxic. "It begins," said Zath, a creature with more arms than sense. Officially, he was a consultant to the United States government. Unofficially, he was about as trustworthy as a snake in a suit. "Our influence grows each day," another alien, Crix, added, adjusting the ridiculous glasses perched on his snout. They were purely decorative, much like the humans they manipulated. "Soon, they won't know which way is up." Zath smiled, if one could call the baring of jagged teeth a smile. "They already don't. Have you seen their political system? It's like watching a star implode." Crix snorted, a sound reminiscent of nails on a chalkboard. "And yet they trust us." The two of them laughed, a horrible grating sound that echoed through the halls of power. Humans, they mused, were so delightfully naive. Back on the burning planet, Ven and his crew stumbled out of the inferno, coughing and swearing, their uniforms singed and their dignity barely intact. "Well, that was fun," Ven rasped, wiping soot off his face. "Just another day in paradise." Drax wheezed beside him, looking like he'd been dragged through a hedge backwards, which he had, but that was another story. "You think they'll thank us for this?" Ven snorted. "They'll probably court-martial us for saving the wrong data." "Wouldn't be the first time," Drax replied, cracking a grin. They headed back to their ship, the Defiant, a name chosen with all the creativity of a bureaucratic committee. It was a clunky, battered thing, but it had saved their skins more times than Ven cared to count. As they lifted off, leaving the smoldering ruin behind, Ven settled into his seat, the familiar creak of the chair a comforting reminder that some things never changed. "So, Cap," Drax said, fiddling with the controls, "what now?" Ven sighed, running a hand through his hair, which was starting to resemble the archive, much to his dismay. "We get this data back to HQ and hope they don't shoot the messenger." He leaned back, watching the stars streak by. Somewhere out there, he suspected, was a whole universe of trouble waiting to find them, like a spaceborne homing beacon for disasters. Meanwhile, Zath and Crix were knee-deep in their own brand of chaos. "These humans," Zath mused, will tear themselves apart with a little nudge. Crix nodded, scanning reports on human behavior, chuckling at the absurdity. Who knew they'd be so easy to sway? But their mirth was short-lived as a third alien joined them, concerned about the humans' unpredictability. They are, however, resourceful, it warned, its voice a whisper like wind through dry leaves. Resourceful, yes, Zath conceded, but predictable in their stubbornness. Yet that's what makes them dangerous, the newcomer insisted, casting a wary glance at the screens displaying Earth's chaotic state. Zath waved a dismissive tentacle. Let them be. We'll adjust our plans as needed. Back on the Defiant, Ven was pondering the very same thought, albeit with more expletives. You think those bastards know we're onto them? Drax shrugged, his broad shoulders barely fitting in the cockpit. They might, but if they didn't before, they sure as hell do now. Great, Ven muttered, sarcasm dripping from his voice like oil from a leaky engine. Just what I needed, more attention from the universe's least wanted. He gazed out at the vast expanse, feeling the weight of responsibility sitting heavily on his shoulders. It was a familiar feeling, one he'd long come to associate with his brand of luck. And as they hurtled through the void, the fires of rebellion spreading across galaxies like a wild fever, Ven couldn't shake the feeling that they were just pawns in a game no one understood. In the grand scheme of things, he mused, it was all just another day on the job, one filled with more questions than answers, and the unsettling realization that sometimes the difference between hero and villain was just a matter of perspective. Drax snapped him out of his reverie with a nudge. Cap, you spaced out again. Ven chuckled, shaking his head, thinking about our next move. Yeah, how about a vacation? Ven laughed, a short, sharp bark. In this line of work, only place we're going is straight to hell, Drax grinned. Well, at least we'll have good company. And with that they continued on their course, the ship a tiny blip against the vast backdrop of an indifferent universe, their path uncertain but determined. Somewhere, the embers of rebellion smoldered and the insidious influence of alien manipulators spread like a cancer. But for Captain Ven Asher, wry humor intact, it was just another day in the endless saga of human defiance. The Defiant hummed softly as it cruised through the void, its hull a patchwork of repairs and corrections. Inside, Captain Ven Asher lounged in the captain's chair, looking as nonchalant as a man who just watched his world burn could possibly appear. His mood was as cheery as a funeral procession on a rainy day. Drax fiddled with the navigation controls, his large fingers surprisingly nimble on the touch interface. So, Cap, any idea what we're supposed to do once we get this data back to HQ? Ven grunted, scratching his chin. I imagine they'll thank us by sending us on another suicide mission. Maybe this time to a planet made entirely of lava. Could be worse, Drax noted, his tone suggesting he struggled to imagine what worse might entail. At least it's not paperwork. Yeah, Ven chuckled darkly. I've always said if I wanted to die of boredom, I'd sit through one of those political broadcasts. Little did Ven know, far across the cosmos, the political scene was indeed heating up with all the grace of a dumpster fire. In the grand, gilded halls of Earth's power brokers, where influence was bought and sold faster than a caffeine fix in a tech office, the aliens were playing a game more convoluted than human tax law. Crix Valter didn't so much walk into the room as he slithered, his presence as subtle as a neon sign in a blackout. He peered over his ridiculous glasses at the assembly of politicians, each one a paragon of self-importance. Gentlemen, Crix began, his voice smoother than cheap whiskey, I'm pleased to report our latest initiative is bearing fruit. A senator from some obscure state leaned forward, his face flushed with the kind of excitement usually reserved for slot machine victories. And what about the international talks? Going swimmingly, Crix assured, though his expression suggested he cared about as much as a cat does for its owner's opinion. We've introduced certain elements into the negotiations. Elements. The senator seemed like a man who preferred his elements shaken, not stirred. Let's just say Crix flashed what might have been a reassuring smile. We're making progress. The kind of progress where everyone wins, especially us. The room erupted in polite applause, the kind that echoed more of obligation than genuine enthusiasm. Crix basked in it, though what he was really basking in was the sweet, heady scent of manipulation well executed. Meanwhile, Zath was working his own brand of magic, or rather misdirection. He stood before a room filled with media representatives, each clutching their microphones like lifelines. "Isn't it true," asked one bold reporter, "that certain decisions have led to an increase in global tensions?" "Ah, tensions," Zath mused, his voice dripping with all the sincerity of a politician's promise. "They're like spices. Too little and the dish is bland, too much and no one wants to eat it. We're merely striking a balance." The reporters, trained to parse through political jargon thicker than a starship's hull, nodded along. Zath's words would translate into tomorrow's headlines, each one carefully crafted to distract and redirect, like a magician performing sleight of hand. Back aboard the Defiant, Ven was having his own issues with distractions. The ship's sensors pinged with the persistence of an unpaid bill collector. "Drax, what the hell is that?" Ven grumbled, his patience worn thinner than a politician's ethics. Drax peered at the screen, his brow furrowing. "Looks like a distress signal." "It's close by." Ven sighed, the kind of sigh reserved for parents of teenagers and captains of half-broken ships. "Of course it is. Can a man fly through space without tripping over someone else's disaster? What do you want to do?" Drax asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Let's take a look," Ven decided. "If it's a trap, we can always leave them to their sorry fate." The Defiant altered course with the grace of a drunken dancer, zeroing in on the source of the signal. It wasn't long before they found it, a small freighter adrift and looking a few steps away from becoming space debris. "Looks like they had a rough time," Drax observed, his understatement worthy of an award. "Rough time?" Ven scoffed. "That thing's seen better days. Hell, I've seen corpses in better shape." The two men suited up, docking with the derelict ship. The airlocks hissed open with all the enthusiasm of a door welcoming in-laws. Inside, the ship was a mess of flickering lights and sparking wires, the kind of ambience that screamed deathtrap more loudly than a moody teenager. "Hello," Ven called out, his voice echoing down the corridor. "Anybody alive in here?" A figure stumbled towards them, limping with the grace of a one-legged man in a marathon. The man's face was streaked with grime, his eyes wide with fear or madness, possibly both. "Thank the stars," he gasped, clutching at Ven like a drowning man clutches a lifeline. "You've got to help me." Ven looked at Drax, who shrugged in the universal language of your call. "What happened here, pal?" "Pirates," the man wheezed. "They took everything. Weapons, supplies, left us to die us." Drax scanned the empty hallways. "Me," the man corrected, his voice tinged with the bitterness of a man cheated at cards. "Well, you're a lucky bastard to be alive," Ven noted, helping the man to his feet. "Lucky we came along too, though I've always said luck's just misfortune in disguise." As they brought the survivor aboard the Defiant, Ven couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The universe had a way of tossing curveballs at him like a disgruntled pitcher, and he was rarely inclined to trust easy breaks. Back on Earth, Crix and Zath were keeping their curveballs spinning. The two of them sat in a posh office, the kind where important decisions were made over even more important drinks. "We've got some concerns," Zath admitted, his expression more serious than usual. "Some of our contacts on Earth are starting to ask questions." Crix sipped at his blue concoction, the liquid glowing ominously in the dim light. "Questions are inevitable. It's the answers we provide that matter. If humans start digging too deep, they won't," Crix interrupted, a touch of arrogance in his voice. "Humans are predictable, Walter. They'll chase shadows while we guide them along." Zath nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Humans had a knack for surprises, usually the unpleasant kind. "And what about Asher?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Crix's smile was cold enough to freeze water in hell. "Asher is a nuisance, a mosquito in our ear. We'll deal with him in due time. Back on the Defiant, Ven was pondering his own due time. The survivor, who'd introduced himself as Lox, was babbling about pirates and conspiracies, most of which Ven filed under crazy ramblings. "You're saying the pirates were working with someone?" Ven asked, skepticism dripping from his words. "I'm telling you, man, they weren't just after goods," Lox insisted, his eyes wide with fervor. "They wanted something else. Information. Well, if you've got conspiracy theories, you've come to the right place," Ven chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "We're experts in chasing wild geese. But this isn't just a theory," Lox exclaimed, his desperation palpable. "There's something bigger going on. You've got to believe me." Ven exchanged a look with Drax, who wore an expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere but here. "All right, we'll look into it," Ven relented, though his tone suggested he was humoring a child. "But first, let's get you to safety." As they altered course, Ven's mind churned with possibilities. Something about Lox's story didn't sit right, like a pebble in a boot. And in his experience, pebbles had a nasty way of turning into avalanches. Meanwhile, the alien overlords of human destiny were fine-tuning their schemes. Zath and Crix watched the unfolding chaos with the satisfaction of puppet masters pulling strings. "It's all coming together," Crix mused, swirling his drink like a sorcerer scrying in a cauldron. "Soon the humans will be too tangled in their own webs to notice us. And if they do?" Zath inquired, though he already knew the answer. "Then we'll be ready," Crix assured, his voice a promise and a threat. "We'll show them just how small their world truly is." Back on the Defiant, Ven Asher was about to discover that very small world. With a new passenger and a head full of doubts, he steered his ship into the unknown, ready to face whatever lay beyond the next star. Because in a universe full of shadows and secrets, Ven knew one truth: the only certainty was uncertainty, and he was determined to navigate it with all the grace of a man who'd seen it all before. And as the ship vanished into the cosmic dark, leaving behind the twisted threads of human and alien design, Ven couldn't help but chuckle. Another day, another disaster. But it was his disaster, damn it, and he intended to see it through to the bitter end. Mira Cade was about as impressed with her government-issued office as a cat would be with a puddle. The decor screamed beige with all the enthusiasm of a cardiac arrest, and the flickering fluorescent lights seemed to be in a constant state of existential crisis. She'd always thought her work as an analyst would involve more action, less staring at numbers that behaved worse than a politician at a strip club. Her computer screen displayed a kaleidoscope of data, much of it contradicting itself so spectacularly that it could have been a metaphor for human nature. But Mira had a sharp eye for details, the kind that could spot a lie even if it was gift-wrapped and delivered with a bow. And lately, the data had been whispering secrets to her. Secrets about leadership decisions that didn't add up, like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. She chewed on the end of her pen, a habit she'd picked up somewhere between college and her first disillusionment with the government. "What are you hiding, you bureaucratic bastards?" she muttered to the screen. "Talking to yourself again, Mira." William, her cubicle neighbor, peeked over the divider with the kind of grin that suggested he thought he was charming. He wasn't. "Only way to get a sensible conversation around here," Mira shot back, not bothering to look up. "What do you want, William?" "Just checking in," he replied, unbothered by the dismissal. "Heard the brass are on edge. Something about the higher-ups making rash calls." "Rash calls?" Mira scoffed. "They've been making rash calls since before I was born. What's new?" "Rumor has it they're in bed with some foreign interests." "Real shady stuff." Mira raised an eyebrow. "Foreign, you say?" "Because last I checked, our international friends could barely organize a piss-up in a brewery, let alone influence our government." William shrugged. "Just passing on what I hear. You know how it is." "Yeah," Mira said, returning to her screen with renewed interest. "I know exactly how it is." Piecing together the inconsistencies felt like trying to unscramble an egg. But Mira had a suspicion, one that curled at the edges of her mind like smoke from a neglected fire. If there was one thing she'd learned in her years of service, it was that where there was smoke, there was usually someone trying to blow it up your arse. Meanwhile, out in the vast, indifferent cold of space, Captain Van Asher and his crew were busy discovering that the universe had more bumps than a teenager's face. The Defiant rattled through space, its patchwork hull groaning like an old man's knees. "Remind me why we're doing this again," Drax asked from his station, tapping at the navigation controls with the kind of precision that suggested he was trying to win a game of solitaire, not steer a spaceship. "Because we're idiots who can't say no to a good conspiracy," Ven replied, eyes on the viewport. "And because if Lox is right, there's something bigger at play. Bigger than us, you mean? Bigger than my ex-wife's idea of a fair settlement, which is saying something." The joke didn't quite land, but then again, humor had a way of getting lost between the stars. Ven's thoughts were interrupted by a proximity alert, the cheerful chime more out of place than a penguin in a desert. Captain Drax said, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. "We've got company, hostile company." Ven's stomach twisted. "Figures, pirates, looks like it. And they're not here for a friendly chat. Prepare to engage," Ven ordered, his voice as steady as he could manage. He'd been through enough scrapes to know the difference between bravado and survival instinct. "Shields up, weapons hot. Let's show these bastards they picked the wrong ship to mess with." The Defiant swung into action, all clumsy grace and raw determination. The pirates' ships loomed out of the darkness, bristling with weaponry and bad intentions. Ven watched them approach, each moment stretching out like a bad movie sequel. "Remember," he said mostly to himself, "we've survived worse," and maybe they had. But that didn't make it any less terrifying when the first volley of laser fire streaked towards them, lighting up the void with deadly sparks. Back on Earth, Mira's hunches had led her down a digital rabbit hole. She'd hacked into more government files than she cared to admit, and what she found made her blood run colder than the Arctic in December. "Alien involvement," she muttered to herself, the words absurd even as they formed. But the evidence was there, buried under layers of official denials and obfuscation. Decisions made not for the benefit of the country, but for external forces that apparently had their fingers in a lot more pies than she'd thought. It was the kind of revelation that could get a person disappeared. But Mira wasn't about to let that stop her. She had a feeling this rabbit hole went deeper than anyone had guessed, and if there was a way to stop whatever was being planned, she intended to find it. Back in the far reaches of space, the battle was not going well. The Defiant was taking hits like a piñata at a particularly enthusiastic children's party, each strike jolting the crew with sickening force. "Drax, you call this navigating?" Ven shouted over the commotion. "It's hard to navigate when the controls are trying to electrocute me." Drax shot back, frantically adjusting their course. Ven gritted his teeth. "Well, do it faster." The pirates were relentless, their ships moving with the kind of precision that suggested they'd done this dance before. Ven had no intention of letting them claim another victim. "If we make it out of this," he called to Lox, who was cowering near the back of the bridge, "you're buying the drinks." The comment was met with a strangled laugh, the kind that came from someone who didn't really find anything funny anymore. But Ven would take what he could get. With the Defiant weaving through space like a drunken wasp, Ven called out more orders, his voice a lifeline for his crew. Together, they fought back. Each shot fired a testament to their stubborn refusal to roll over and die. On Earth, Mira was putting the pieces together with the kind of dogged determination that could make even a terrier proud. She'd found links between the alien presence and the recent spike in government paranoia, connections that were as dangerous as they were enlightening. She knew the risks, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was onto something big. Something that had the potential to change everything if only she could get the right people to listen. In space, the battle raged on. The pirates had underestimated their prey, a mistake Ven was determined to make them regret. With each maneuver, each tactical decision, he chipped away at their resolve, turning the tide of the fight. Captain Drax said, a note of triumph in his voice, "I think we've got them on the run. Good, Vin replied, not daring to believe it until the last hostile ship was reduced to so much space junk. Let's make sure they don't come back. With the battle winding down, Vin allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They'd survived, and for now, that was enough. On Earth, Mira was preparing to take the next step. She'd compiled her findings, ready to present them to anyone who would listen. It was a gamble, a shot in the dark, but she was willing to take it. If there was one thing Mira Cade hated, it was being left in the dark. And if there was one thing she loved, it was proving people wrong. As the Defiant cruised on, its crew battered but unbroken, Captain Van Asher couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. But they'd face whatever came next together, with all the sarcasm and stubbornness they could muster. Because in a universe full of shadows and secrets, sometimes the only thing you could count on was your own damn self. And for Vin, that was more than enough. Captain Van Asher liked to think of himself as a man who thrived on chaos. Not because he had a particular fondness for it. Rather, it was the only consistent thing he'd ever known. Take this current escapade, for instance. The Defiant might have just survived a pirate attack, but the universe had a knack for taking a dump on your parade just when you started feeling smug. As the ship limped through space, patched up with spit and hope, Vin pondered their next move. Drax, give me a status report. Drax, whose patience was as thin as the ship's hull, tapped at the navigation screen. Well, Cap, if you're looking for some good news, keep looking. Shields are knackered, and our weapons are about as useful as a chocolate teapot right now. Fantastic, Vin muttered. And here I thought we'd turned a corner, more like hit a brick wall, Drax replied, shaking his head. What's the plan? The plan, Vin said, scratching his stubble, is not dying. Solid plan, Drax acknowledged. But maybe we should aim a bit higher. Fine, Vin relented. Let's not die and find out what the hell these aliens are up to. Meanwhile, Mira Cade was busy navigating the kind of bureaucratic hell that made Dante's Inferno look like a holiday brochure. Her discovery of alien involvement had kicked a hornet's nest, exactly as she'd expected, but she was no stranger to sticky situations. She'd reached out to the only person she figured could help Captain Van Asher. She just hoped he wasn't dead yet. Her office, with its flickering lights and paint job more depressing than a funeral in February, was not where she expected to hatch a plan to save the world. But here she was, digging through layers of conspiracy like a dog after a particularly juicy bone. William, her ever-curious cubicle neighbor, leaned over the divider again. Mira, you look like you've seen a ghost. Wish it was just a ghost, Mira said, rubbing her temples. I've got a line on something big, bigger than your usual daily revelations. Let's just say if I'm right, we're all screwed. He raised an eyebrow. Are we talking nuclear screwed, or aliens are involved? And if what I've found is true, they've been pulling strings we didn't even know existed. She glanced at him, gauging his reaction. Ever get the feeling we're just puppets in someone else's show? William nodded slowly. Every Monday morning, Mira. Every Monday morning. Mira returned to her screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she sent a message through a secure channel. If Captain Asher was still out there, she needed him to know just how deep the rabbit hole went. Back on the Defiant, Vin was doing his best to keep the ship flying and his crew sane. His comm badge chimed, a sound more irritating than any child's toy. It was Lox, the de facto comms officer, holding the device like it might explode. Cap, message for you, Lox said, holding it out like it was some alien artifact. Vin took the comm badge, the holographic display flickering to life. Mira's message was brief and to the point, a quality he appreciated in a world full of waffle. Looks like our analyst friend is onto something, Vin said to Drax as he scanned the contents. Aliens pulling the strings, political maneuvering. Same old, great. And here I was thinking we were the center of the universe, not even close, my friend. But if these aliens are playing puppet master, we need to cut the strings. Drax sighed, fiddling with the half-functional controls. And how do you propose we do that? We're sitting ducks out here. Vin thought for a moment. We play their game. But on our terms, Earth wasn't faring much better. Mira's discoveries had caused quite the stir in the halls of power, as the realization dawned that they might be little more than pawns in a cosmic chess match. Crix Valter, the smooth-talking alien who had woven himself into Earth's upper echelons, was watching events unfold with the kind of detached amusement that only an outsider could muster. He was good at this game, having played it on more worlds than he cared to count. Standing in a meeting room filled with Earth's so-called leaders, Crix flashed a smile that could shatter glass. "Gentlemen, I assure you everything is under control." The skepticism in the room was palpable. One of the representatives, an older man whose face had seen better days, leaned forward. "Under control, you say? Because it seems to me we're about to be colonized." "There's no need for such dramatics," Crix said, his voice smoother than a politician's promise. "We are here to help, not to conquer." Mira would have laughed if she wasn't so busy trying to avert the apocalypse. She and William had managed to piece together enough to make even the most hardened skeptic uneasy. "So what's the plan, Mira?" William asked, as they walked down the corridor that smelled faintly of despair and disinfectant. "We need to get this information to someone who can do something about it," she replied. Someone not knee-deep in alien pocket change. Easier said than done, of course. But Mira had always been a fan of the impossible. It was just the improbable that tripped her up. Back aboard the Defiant, Ven was formulating a strategy with all the finesse of a sledgehammer. "Right, Drax, we need to get this ship shipshape." Drax raised an eyebrow. "And how do you suggest we do that without any viable parts?" "Magic, something like that. We're headed to the nearest salvage yard. I'm betting we can patch her up enough to get us where we need to go." "And where's that exactly?" "Earth," Ven said, a grim determination settling over him. "If Mira's right, we need to be there to back her up." He knew the risks: aliens, governments, the potential end of civilization as they knew it. But Ven was a man with little left to lose, and if he was going down, he'd damn well take as many bastards with him as he could. The Defiant limped its way to the nearest scrapyard, a sight more dismal than Ven's last tax return. But he and his crew set to work with the kind of resolve usually reserved for last-minute exam cramming. With each bolt tightened and wire secured, Ven felt a little less like the universe's punching bag. It wasn't much, but it was a start. On Earth, Mira was preparing to make her move. She'd arranged a meeting with a contact she hoped was still human these days. You couldn't be too sure. The meeting place was a dingy bar in the less reputable part of town, the kind of place that hadn't seen a health inspector in decades. Mira liked it immediately. Her contact, a grizzled former operative with more scars than a horror film protagonist, sat nursing a drink that looked like it could strip paint. "Mira Cade, never thought I'd see you outside the office." "Desperate times," she replied, sliding into the seat opposite him. "I've got intel that could make your hair curl." He raised an eyebrow. "Aliens, right? Is it that obvious? Rumors fly faster than a starship these days." "What do you need from me?" "Contacts, access, anything." "I need to get this in front of the right people before it's too late." He nodded, taking a sip of his questionable beverage. "Consider it done. But watch your back, Mira. You're playing a dangerous game." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Mira said, standing to leave. "Thanks for the help. Don't mention it. Seriously, don't." As she stepped out into the night, Mira felt a surge of determination. The odds were against her, and her plan was half-baked at best, but she wasn't about to let that stop her. If she'd learned anything, it was that the universe didn't hand out free passes. You had to take what you could get and run with it. Back in space, the Defiant was finally operational enough to be considered more than a death trap. Ven and his crew set a course for Earth, their resolve as battered as the ship but no less unyielding. "Ready for this?" Ven asked Drax as they settled in for the journey. "Not even slightly," Drax replied with a grin that was more grimace. "But since when has that stopped us?" "Exactly," Ven agreed. "Let's go show those alien bastards what happens when you mess with the wrong species." As the Defiant powered its way through the stars, Ven couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. It was a ridiculous notion, given their situation, but hope, like cockroaches and terrible pop songs, was notoriously hard to kill. On Earth, Mira was gearing up for the next stage of her plan. She had the intel, she had the contacts, and now she just needed the opportunity. It wouldn't be easy, but she'd come too far to back down now. As the Defiant hurtled towards Earth, Captain Ven Asher and his motley crew prepared for whatever lay ahead. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been, but if Ven had learned anything from years of navigating through the universe's crap, it was that sometimes the best you could do was take one step forward and hope the ground didn't fall out from under you. And so, with sarcasm as their shield and cynicism as their sword, they prepared to face the unknown. Because in a universe full of shadows and secrets, sometimes all you had were your wits and the will to fight back. "Here we go," Ven said, as Earth loomed into view. "Time to see what we're really made of." And with that, the Defiant plunged into the fray, ready to take on the universe one sarcastic comment at a time. The Defiant, held together by spit, duct tape, and the sheer stubbornness of its crew, continued its shaky approach towards Earth. The ship rattled like an old tin can, an apt metaphor for their collective mental state. Captain Ven Asher, sitting in the captain's chair that had seen more ass than an interstellar brothel, watched the view screen with his trademark expression, a mix of grim determination and someone who's just realized they've stepped in something unpleasant. "Drax," Ven called over his shoulder, "how are chances looking?" Drax, hunched over the navigation controls like they owed him money, grunted. "Chances of what?" "Surviving, crashing, or something in between." "All of the above," Ven replied, scratching the stubble on his jaw. "I'm feeling optimistic, must be the lack of oxygen." "Well, if optimism's your thing, we're right on schedule for a catastrophic breakdown," Drax said. "Or a miracle. Betting heavily on the breakdown, though." Ven chuckled, though it was devoid of real humor. "A miracle would be a nice change of pace. Haven't seen one of those since we stumbled out of the last bar fight alive." The ship's distressingly slow crawl towards Earth mirrored the state of their mission. Everything seemed to be hanging by a thread, and the universe looked ready to snip it at any moment. Meanwhile, down on Earth, Mira Cade was knee-deep in the kind of despair that made the word bleak seem like a delightful understatement. Her latest meeting with the contact had gone about as well as a grenade in a china shop, leaving her with more questions than answers and a headache that could rival a hangover from drinking alien moonshine. "William," she called over to her cubicle neighbor, who had the unfortunate habit of popping up at the worst possible times. He was currently balancing a stack of papers like they were made of gold leaf. "Yeah, Mira?" he asked, peering over the divider like a meerkat on watch. "You ever get the feeling we're just spinning our wheels here?" William shrugged. "Depends. Are we talking metaphorical wheels, or are you hinting at some kind of escape plan involving actual wheels?" "Metaphorical, unfortunately," Mira said, tapping away at her keyboard. "We've got intel on aliens pulling strings like they're the universe's worst puppeteers, and I can't even get a meeting with someone who can actually do something about it." "Maybe they're just really bad at their jobs," William suggested. "Or maybe they just don't care." "Probably both," Mira sighed. "But if we don't get this under control, Earth's gonna be more toast than a breakfast buffet." Back on the Defiant, Ven and his crew were prepping for their descent into chaos, also known as Earth's atmosphere. They had a plan, the kind you come up with when you're out of options and full of desperation. "All right, people," Ven said, gathering his crew in the cluttered common area that doubled as their war room. "What's the one thing we know about these alien bastards?" "They've got more fingers in more pies than a clumsy baker," Lox offered, earning a nod of agreement from the rest of the crew. "Exactly," Ven said, "which means they are stretched thin. They think they've got us all figured out, that we're too busy fighting each other to notice them pulling the strings." "And?" Drax prompted, arms crossed, looking like a man who'd eaten lemons and liked it. "And we're going to yank those strings," Ven said. Hard enough to make them regret ever trying to play us. The plan was simple, in the way that jumping off a cliff and hoping you remembered your parachute is simple. There was talk of a hidden human tech, an advancement that was as much myth as it was hope, a secret weapon that could tip the scales. "Let me guess, it's on Earth," Drax said, voice laced with sarcasm. "Because where else would a mythical weapon be when you're hurtling towards the planet with a ship held together by prayer?" "Correct," Ven replied. "We're heading for a research facility that's supposedly the birthplace of this tech. If it's there, we grab it and show those aliens what humanity's really made of. And if it's not there," Lox asked, ever the optimist. "Then we're screwed," Ven admitted. "But let's not dwell on that. We'll cross that bridge when it collapses under us." As they descended towards Earth, the sight of the planet below was almost comforting, in a "this is what we're fighting for" kind of way. Even if it was currently more a battleground than a home. Mira was busy preparing her next move, trying to make sense of the chaos she'd uncovered. Her contact had hinted at something big, but getting to it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack that was currently on fire. "William, you still got that security clearance you borrowed from the IT guy?" she asked, rifling through files like a squirt on a caffeine high. "Still got it," William confirmed. "And I'm pretty sure he still doesn't know it's missing." "Good. I need access to the research facility on the outskirts," Mira said. "There's something there that might help us." "Is this the part where we save the world or the part where we just make things worse?" "Hopefully the former," Mira said with a weak smile. "But if it's the latter, we'll at least go down swinging." On the Defiant, Ven and his crew were in the final stages of their approach, a task made all the more daunting by the fact that landing was more of a suggestion than a certainty. "All right, folks," Ven said, eyeing the controls like they were about to sprout fangs. "Brace yourselves for impact or a soft landing if we're lucky." The ship rattled and shook, complaining like an old miser, but somehow, through a combination of skill and sheer luck, they managed to touch down without becoming a new crater. "Well," Drax said, exhaling a breath he'd been holding. "That was less disastrous than expected." "I'll take it," Ven replied, unclipping his harness. "Let's get moving. We've got a date with Destiny and she's not known for her patience." They disembarked, the air heavy with tension and the promise of violence. Earth was a battlefield, but one they knew well, a home with its share of both beauty and scars. Mira and William were making their way towards the facility, a building that loomed large and foreboding against the skyline. The kind of place you'd expect to find either groundbreaking science or an army of disgruntled employees. "Okay, Mira," William said, as they approached the security checkpoint. "How do we get past the guards without ending up in a cell?" "Simple," Mira said, pulling out an ID card that definitely didn't have her face on it. "We lie." "Right," William said, straightening up and putting on his best not guilty face. "Here goes nothing." The guards at the checkpoint were as attentive as a pair of overfed cats, but Mira's ID worked its magic, and they were waved through with barely a glance. As they entered the facility, Mira felt a flicker of hope, one that was quickly extinguished by the realization that they were deep in the lion's den, with no way to tell if they'd find the answers they needed or just a mess of unanswered questions. Back with Ven and the crew, they were moving with a purpose, half desperation, half resolve, through the chaos that had engulfed the planet's surface. The rebellion was in full swing, humans and aliens clashing in a dance of destruction that felt endless and exhausting. "Anyone got eyes on that facility?" Ven called out, squinting through the debris-strewn streets as if trying to spot a needle in a particularly angry haystack. "Over there," Drax replied, pointing towards a structure that looked like it had come straight out of a dystopian nightmare. "Looks like we're in for a fun time." "Fun's not exactly the word I'd use," Lox muttered, checking the charge on his weapon. "But it's going to be something, that's for sure." As they made their way towards the facility, Mira and William were already navigating its labyrinthine corridors, the air heavy with the scent of ozone and antiseptic. "Are we sure this is the right place?" William asked, glancing around at the sterile walls like they might suddenly sprout teeth. "It's the only place we've got," Mira said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and determination. "If what we're looking for is here, we can't afford to miss it." They found themselves in a lab filled with equipment that looked more suited to mad scientists than government researchers. Computers hummed ominously, and a series of screens displayed data that made no sense to anyone without a PhD. "This better be it," Mira muttered, rummaging through the data as if it held all the answers to the universe's most inconvenient questions. Back outside, Ven and his crew had reached the facility, their presence acknowledged by the unwelcome sound of gunfire. "So much for a quiet entry," Drax said, firing back with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for bar brawls. Ven ducked behind cover, his mind racing. They were close, he could feel it, a nagging certainty that they were on the brink of something big, something that could change everything. "Keep them busy," Ven ordered, gesturing towards the facility entrance. "I'll find Mira and see if we can't turn this mess around." Inside, Mira was growing more frustrated by the second. The data was right there, tantalizingly close yet just out of reach. It was like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded and handcuffed. Come on," she hissed, fingers flying over the keys. "There has to be something we can use." Outside, Ven's luck was running as thin as the air. He wasn't sure how long they could hold out, but surrender wasn't in his vocabulary. "How's it looking in there, Mira?" he shouted into his comm, hoping against hope she had some good news. "We've got something," Mira replied, though her voice was tinged with uncertainty. "I'm not sure what it does, but it looks big, possibly dangerous." "Sounds like my kind of gamble," Ven said with a grin that bordered on manic. "Get it ready. We're going to need all the help we can get." The rebellion intensified around them, a storm of chaos and violence that threatened to consume everything. But in the midst of it all, there was a glimmer of hope, a chance that maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide. "All right, Defiant crew," Ven shouted, rallying his troops with a kind of reckless bravado only he could muster. "Let's show these alien bastards what humans are made of." And with that, they charged forward, eyes fixed on the horizon. Because in a universe that seemed determined to break them, they were going to fight like hell to bend it to their will. The Defiance corridors rattled ominously, as if the ship was clearing its throat before a particularly unpleasant conversation. Captain Ven Asher's finger tapped restlessly against the control panel, each tap a silent swear word aimed at the universe. The ship had ostensibly survived the landing, but that didn't mean it had done so gracefully. "Kind of like a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest," Drax muttered, his eyes glued to the navigation screen like he was trying to win a staring contest. "We made it, but it's not pretty. Story of my life," Ven replied, striding toward the airlock with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Let's get ready to give those aliens a taste of human hospitality." Drax raised an eyebrow. "You mean the kind with poisoned tea and a handshake with a joy buzzer?" "Exactly." Ven grinned, a feral baring of teeth that promised trouble. "Let's go make friends." As the crew of the Defiant prepared to disembark once more, Mira and William were neck-deep in data back at the research facility. Mira's fingers danced over the keyboard with a speed that suggested caffeine addiction rather than skill, while William hovered like a nervous hen, peering over her shoulder. "What's this doohickey supposed to do, anyway?" William asked, his voice tinged with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for unattended briefcases on public transport. "According to these blueprints," Mira began, gesturing at the mess of technical jargon on the screen, "this thing can disrupt the alien network. A glorified spanner in the works, if you will. Please tell me it doesn't also open a portal to hell or activate a self-destruct sequence," William said, backing away slightly, as if the computer might suddenly explode. "Only one way to find out," Mira said with a shrug that might have been nonchalance but was more likely resignation. "We've got no other choice." Meanwhile, Ven and his merry band of desperados were charging towards the facility's entrance like a herd of particularly disgruntled buffalo. Gunfire echoed around them, a cacophony of chaos that was almost comforting in its familiarity. "Keep those shots tight," Ven barked, ducking as a particularly enthusiastic laser blast sizzled past his ear. "And for God's sake, try not to blow up anything important." Lox, who had a penchant for sarcasm that could cut through steel, glanced over. "Define important, because right now my list includes not getting vaporized." "Noted," Ven replied, the corner of his mouth twitching up in a wry smile. "But if you see any aliens, feel free to introduce them to our charming human hospitality." Inside the facility, Mira was finally making headway, or at least that's what she told herself as she glared at the screen, willing it to cooperate. The data was a tangled mess, a digital Gordian knot that seemed determined to drive her to insanity. "Okay," she said, more to herself than to William, "if I can just—" The screen went dark with a mechanical sigh that was eerily similar to a death rattle. "Wonderful," William said, his tone dry enough to spontaneously combust. "Do you want me to start panicking now, or should I wait until you're done?" "Give it a minute," Mira replied, smacking the side of the monitor like she was trying to coax life back into an ancient TV set. "I've almost got it." Back outside, the fight raged on. Ven and his crew pushed forward, their progress marked by the occasional explosion and the rapidly dwindling number of alien soldiers. "How's it looking in there, Mira?" Ven shouted into his comm, hoping the reception was better than his mood. "We're working on it," Mira's voice crackled back, the words laced with frustration and determination. "Just hold on a little longer." "That's the plan," Ven muttered, dodging another near miss with the kind of grace that could only be described as accidental. "If anything changes, let me know." "Oh, you'll know," Mira promised, her tone flat. "Probably right before everything goes spectacularly wrong." Inside the facility, Mira finally managed to coax the system back to life. The screen flickered, displaying a series of commands that looked promising, if not a little ominous. "All right, here goes nothing," Mira said, initiating the sequence with a flourish that belied her nerves. A low hum filled the room, gradually building into a crescendo that made the walls shiver and the lights flicker like a disco on its last legs. The alien network was under attack, chaos spreading through their systems like wildfire. Back outside, Ven watched as the alien soldiers faltered, their previously flawless coordination crumbling like a house of cards in a gale. "Looks like your magic trick worked, Mira," Ven said, flashing a grin that was half relief, half disbelief. "They're falling apart out here." "Good," Mira replied, her voice steady but her hands shaking as she clung to the console. "Now let's hope they don't have a backup plan." The tide was turning. Ven could feel it in his bones, the kind of instinctual certainty that only came when you were staring down the barrel of either victory or disaster. "All right, folks," Ven called to his crew, rallying them with the kind of optimism that bordered on lunacy. "Time to show these aliens what humans can do when we're properly motivated." "Properly pissed off, you mean," Drax muttered, but he followed Ven's lead, his own weapon blasting with renewed zeal. The fight intensified, but the balance had shifted. The aliens, once an organized and terrifying force, were now scrambling, their communications in disarray, their ranks breaking like cheap fireworks. "Looks like they weren't expecting a bunch of stubborn humans to ruin their day," Locke said with a grin that promised mischief and mayhem in equal measure. "Nothing like a little surprise to keep things interesting," Ven replied, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any sign of regrouping. "Let's keep it up. They won't know what hit them." In the facility, Mira was still glued to the screen, monitoring the chaos she'd unleashed. William hovered nearby, a mixture of awe and anxiety written across his face. "You really did it," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You actually did it." "Don't sound so surprised," Mira replied, though there was a hint of pride in her voice. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we've got them on the back foot." "Assuming they don't have another trick up their sleeves," William pointed out, ever the pessimist. "If they do, we'll just have to deal with it," Mira said, her jaw set with determination. "We've come too far to back down now." Outside, Ven and his team were pressing their advantage, using every bit of cover and cunning to outmaneuver the disoriented aliens. The battle was fierce, but there was a sense of unity among the humans, a shared purpose that was as invigorating as it was dangerous. "Looks like we've got some unexpected allies," Drax said, pointing towards a group of aliens fighting alongside human rebels. "Guess they didn't get the memo that we're the enemy. Or maybe they just hate being bossed around as much as we do," Ven replied, watching as the alien defectors dove into the fray with gusto. "Either way, I'll take all the help we can get." With the addition of their newfound allies, the humans began to rally. The air buzzed with the kind of energy that only came from a collective effort, each individual fighting for more than just survival. "They're really getting their asses kicked now," Lox observed, firing off a shot that sent 2 alien soldiers diving for cover. "Which is exactly what we need," Ven said, his voice carrying the weight of hope and desperation. "We've got to keep pushing. If we let up now, they'll regroup and hit back harder." With renewed vigor, the humans and their unexpected allies surged forward, determined to make the most of their surprise advantage. The alien forces, caught off guard and reeling, struggled to maintain any semblance of order. "Keep the pressure on them," Ven shouted, his voice rising above the din of battle. "Let's show them what happens when you underestimate humanity." As they advanced, the alien lines crumbled, folding under the relentless pressure. For the first time, Ven felt a flicker of genuine hope, an ember that threatened to spark into a blaze of victory. Back in the facility, Mira and William kept a close eye on the unfolding chaos, ready to intervene if the situation demanded it. "It's working," William said, a note of disbelief still coloring his words. "We're actually doing it." "Don't jinx it," Mira warned, her eyes focused on the screens. Things can still go sideways at any moment, but despite her caution, there was an undeniable sense of triumph in the air, a feeling that things were finally turning in their favor. "Let's keep it up," Mira said, her voice a mixture of determination and optimism. "We've got them on the ropes and it's going to stay that way." Outside, the battle continued to rage, but the tide was well and truly turning. The alien forces, once so terrifying and organized, were now chaotic and disjointed, their losses mounting with every passing moment. "We're almost there," Ven shouted, his voice a rallying cry that echoed across the battlefield. "Let's finish this." His words were met with a chorus of agreement, the humans and their allies pressing forward with renewed determination. The end was in sight, and for the first time it seemed possible that they might actually succeed. As the battle drew to a close, Ven couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction, an acknowledgement that even in the face of overwhelming odds, humanity had managed to defy expectations once again. "We did it," Drax said, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. "We really did it." "Yeah," Ven replied, his gaze sweeping across the battlefield. "But we're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to do." As they regrouped and took stock of their situation, it was clear that while they had won this battle, the war was far from over. But for now, they had achieved the impossible, proving that even in the darkest times, humanity was a force to be reckoned with. And for Ven and his crew, that was more than enough. "All right," Captain Ven Asher muttered, squinting through the smoke-filled chaos of the battlefield. "Let's wrap this up before someone decides to introduce another new and exciting way to die." The Defiance crew was spread out, every one of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else but here. Like, say, a nice volcanic planet without breathable air. But hell, they'd taken on worse odds before breakfast. Somewhere in the distance, an alien soldier was making what sounded suspiciously like a retreat, though it might have just been a very creative form of surrender. Drax, the eternal pessimist with a heart of tarnished gold, was busy jabbing at the navigation screen as if it owed him money. "So, Captain, are we planning on surviving this, or is it one of those die gloriously days?" Ven grinned, though it was the kind of grin that involved more teeth than humor. "I'm voting for the former, but let's keep die gloriously as plan B." Good to know we're sticking to a well-thought-out strategy, Drax replied, his sarcasm sharp enough to cut through the tension. Think the aliens got the memo if they didn't. We'll be sure to send it with a ribbon, Ven said, firing off a round that sent an alien scrambling for cover. Meanwhile, a few galaxies away, or maybe just next door, time and space being what they were, Mira Cade was wrestling with a computer system that seemed to have been designed by sadists or, worse, politicians. The room smelled like burnt coffee and desperation, which was probably William's fault. He hovered behind her like a shadow made of anxiety. Still nothing? William asked, his voice a hopeful blend of nerves and caffeine shakes. Mira resisted the urge to throw the monitor at him. Unless you count a cryptic error message as something, then no. But hey, at least it's consistent. Should I start praying to the tech gods? William offered, clutching a mug like it was a life raft. Depends. Do they accept sacrifices of caffeine and dignity? Mira retorted, smacking the keyboard in a way that was more therapeutic than effective. The screen flickered, as if deciding whether to cooperate or self-destruct in a blaze of apathy. Outside, the Defiant was making a valiant attempt to hold itself together, a task as thankless as organizing a family reunion for warring species. Ven was doing his best to ignore the ominous creaks and groans coming from the ship's hull, a symphony of impending disaster that really tied the whole battlefield experience together. Drax, Ven called, dodging another volley of alien fire with all the grace of a caffeinated squirt. Status report. We're still alive. Barely, Drax replied, his fingers flying across the controls like a disgruntled pianist. Ship's holding, but I wouldn't bet on it for long. Shields are about as effective as a paper umbrella in a monsoon. They always did have a knack for understatement, Ven said with a grim smile. Let's see if we can keep it that way. In the cramped confines of Mira's office, where the lights flickered like they were auditioning for a horror movie, she managed to untangle a particularly stubborn piece of code. A triumphant beep echoed from the computer, signaling something that could either be progress or a countdown to oblivion. All right, here goes nothing, Mira announced, her voice a mix of hope and resignation. She initiated the sequence, fingers crossed metaphorically since she needed both hands to keep the system from rebelling. The building began to hum with an energy that was either technological genius at work or the beginning of an incipient meltdown. Mira decided it was best not to ask which. Back on the battlefield, Ven's comm crackled to life with Mira's voice, a welcome sound amidst the chaos. Captain, we've got their network on the ropes. If you can keep them distracted just a little longer, we might pull this off. Consider it done, Ven answered, dodging a blast that really wanted to rearrange his molecular structure. Just make sure you save us a seat at the victory party. Assuming there's a party, Drax added, ever the realist. Or a victory, Lox chimed in, because optimism was apparently in short supply. Hey, if we're going down, it's not gonna be quietly, Ven said, rallying his crew with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for impending doom. His team pressed forward, a ragtag group of rebels and reluctant heroes, each one stubbornly refusing to acknowledge that they were one wrong move away from becoming interstellar dust. Looks like the aliens are getting a little antsy, Drax noted, his tone somewhere between amusement and abject terror. Their communication lines are a mess. I'd say we've successfully annoyed them. Let's hope they don't have a plan B, Ven replied, though he knew better than to assume anything when it came to their extraterrestrial foes. Inside, Mira was sweating over the console, her every action a gamble with the universe's least favorite odds. The data spilled across the screen in a chaotic dance of numbers and symbols, each one a potential key to turning the tide. William, ever helpful in his jittery way, watched from a safe distance. How's it looking? Like a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing, Mira replied, though her fingers never stopped moving. She peered at the screen, willing it to cooperate. But we're getting there. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it, Ven's voice crackled through the comm, a lifeline in the storm. Looks like they're starting to turn on each other. Nothing like a little internal chaos to spice things up, Mira said with a wry smile. Out on the battlefield, the alien forces were fracturing, their once unified front breaking apart like a bad cover band after a disastrous gig. Ven took full advantage, rallying his crew for one last push. "Let's show these aliens what happens when you screw with the wrong planet," he shouted, his words a battle cry that echoed across the field. "You mean the right planet," Drax corrected, loosing a volley of fire that sent an enemy scrambling. "Depends on your perspective," Ven replied, dodging another blast. "Personally, I'd rather be anywhere else right now. Could be worse," Drax said, though the conviction in his voice was debatable. "At least we're not dead." Yet, Lox added helpfully. "Always the optimist," Ven muttered, though he couldn't help but smile. In the face of certain death, Gallo's humor was as good a weapon as any. As Mira continued to work her magic, or whatever it was tech people did when they were saving the galaxy, William hovered closer, equal parts impressed and terrified. "You think this will really disrupt their control?" he asked, voice trembling just a bit. "Unless they have a backup plan, yeah," Mira replied, channeling all the confidence she could muster. "We've hit them where it hurts." Back on the battlefield, Ven could see the tide turning. The aliens were in disarray, their once impenetrable strategies unraveling like a cheap sweater. "They're falling apart," Drax observed, with the kind of satisfaction usually reserved for critics at a bad play. "Nice to see we're not the only ones having a bad day." "Yep, nothing like a shared existential crisis to bring people together," Ven replied, firing off a few more shots for good measure. With the aliens' plans unraveling faster than a poorly knit sweater, Ven and his crew seized the opportunity, pushing forward with renewed determination. Their newfound allies, human and alien alike, joined in the fight with vigor and a healthy dose of vengeance. "Looks like we've got a party now," Lox said, grinning as he fired at an alien soldier who never saw it coming. "An intergalactic rager. Just make sure we're the ones who leave with the prize," Ven replied, though he knew the real prize was getting out alive. In Mira's office, the air was thick with tension and the smell of burnt circuits. The console beeped with what could only be described as a victory chirp. "We did it," Mira said, her voice a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "The system's theirs again. Let's hope they don't have anything else up their sleeves." "Great," William sighed, slumping back into his chair like a deflated balloon. "So what now?" Mira said, a hint of a smile curling at her lips. "Now we watch the fireworks." Out on the battlefield, the aliens were in full retreat. Ven's crew, battered but unbroken, watched as their foes fell back, unable to withstand the human onslaught. "We did it," Drax said, disbelief coloring his voice. "We actually did it. Don't act so surprised," Ven replied, though he was feeling a bit incredulous himself. "We're a stubborn bunch when we want to be." With the battle finally over, the crew of the Defiant regrouped, taking stock of their battered selves and their even more battered ship. It wasn't pretty, but they'd survived. For now, that was enough. Back on Earth, Mira and William watched the news unfold, reports of the aliens' retreat streaming in from every corner of the globe. "We did it," William said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. "We actually did it." "Yeah," Mira replied, though she knew the fight was far from over. But there's still work to do. As Ven and his crew prepared to leave the battlefield, triumphant for now but aware of the challenges ahead, he couldn't help but appreciate the irony of it all. They'd survived against the odds, proving once again that humans were nothing if not persistent. "And they said we'd never make it," Drax muttered, shaking his head. "Shows what they know," Ven replied, feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. As they climbed back aboard the Defiant, Ven knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, they'd face it together. And as long as they had each other, they had a fighting chance. And that, in the grand scheme of things, was more than he could have hoped for. The Galactic Archive, once a proud bastion of boundless knowledge, now looked like it had hosted the universe's messiest dinner party, and forgot to invite the cleanup crew. Flames licked at its sides, providing an ironic warmth to the vacuum of space. At least Mira could check save galactic history off her bucket list, assuming she lived long enough to have one. Inside the Defiant, Captain Van Asher surveyed the ruins from the bridge window, like a reluctant tourist forced to admire an ugly monument. Hell of a view, he muttered, scratching at the stubble that had taken up residence on his chin during the battle. Remind me never to book a vacation here. Drax, ever the beacon of sunshine, didn't look up from the controls. Don't worry, Cap. I hear the next destination's even worse. Swamps, mosquitoes the size of your ego. Ven snorted. I'll pack the bug spray then. Meanwhile, Mira Cade sat in her government-issued office, staring at the computer system she'd been wrestling with for what felt like an eternity. She'd finally managed to wrestle the beast into submission, but the victory tasted as bitter as the coffee she'd been chugging like a university student during finals week. Guess we did it, Mira said, leaning back in her chair as the computer screen blinked to life, displaying a message of triumph. Well, more of a whimper of success, but she'd take it. We saved the knowledge of the galaxy. No pressure or anything. William, who'd been hovering like a concerned moth, grinned with the relief of a man who just realized he wouldn't have to explain an interstellar disaster to his superiors, and without burning the place down. Mostly. Mira smirked, her fingers still twitching from the adrenaline. Give me some credit. I only almost fried the entire system. Just don't ask me to do it again anytime soon, noted William said, plopping down into a chair that protested with a screech. So what's next? Mira echoed, peering at the data flowing across the screen. We rebuild, and maybe get a coffee machine that doesn't smell like despair. Back on Earth, the corridors of power bustled with the kind of frantic energy only a near-apocalypse can inspire. Deals were being struck, alliances formed, all under the comforting illusion that the same mistakes wouldn't be repeated. Because history never repeats itself, right? Crix Valter, the alien who'd mastered Earth's political stage as if he'd been born into it, watched the proceedings with the kind of detached amusement one might reserve for a particularly uninspiring soap opera. Humans, he mused, adjusting his suit, which was tailored a little too perfectly. Always eager to rebuild what they've managed to tear down. An aide scurried over, sweating through his ill-fitting suit. Sir, the reports from the front are positive. The Defiance crew pulled off a miracle. Crix nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Miracles are just disasters dressed in their Sunday best. But yes, the humans performed admirably. We should consider rewarding them. The aide blinked, clearly surprised that Crix would suggest something so generous. A commendation, perhaps, or a promotion, or we could let them retire, Crix suggested, his voice carrying a hint of humor. They've earned at least that much. As the aide scuttled off, probably to draft some sort of commendation speech littered with platitudes, Crix considered his own role in all this. It had been his gambit that brought the Defiant into play, his gamble to trust the wily and unpredictable humans. And now the galaxy would keep spinning, for better or worse. Floating above the battlefield, the Defiant limped back towards Earth, its hull battered but unbroken, much like its crew. Inside, Ven and his team gathered in the common area, which was about as common as a hole-in-the-wall dive bar with sticky floors and questionable patrons. Drink anyone? Lox asked, holding up a bottle of something that could either be an alien delicacy or industrial cleaner. The label was long gone, probably in the great purge of the kitchen cabinets. Ven raised a hand. Hell, why not? We earned it. And if it kills us, at least we'll go out with a bang. Drax took the bottle, inspecting it with the careful eye of a man who'd learned the hard way to distrust alien liquids. Here's to surviving another day, he said, pouring a generous measure into a row of mismatched cups. To surviving, Mira echoed, reaching over to grab a cup. And maybe, just maybe, to learning something from all this. Ven lifted his cup, though his expression was more cynical than celebratory, and to making sure the history books know who to thank or blame. The The cups clinked together, a sound both solemn and hopeful in the quiet aftermath of chaos. They drank, the liquid burning its way down their throats. It wasn't great, but it was strong, and sometimes that was enough. Sitting back, Ven let out a sigh. Think they'll remember us, Drax. The scrappy crew that saved the galaxy. Drax shrugged, a grin playing at his lips. If they don't, we'll just remind them. Loudly, the crew chuckled, the kind of laughter that comes from narrowly escaping death and living to tell the tale. They'd won this round, but they all knew there'd be another fight waiting somewhere down the line. There always was. Back on Earth, Mira found herself standing before the Galactic Archive, or what was left of it. Workers bustled about, a chaotic dance of restoration efforts. The smell of burnt metal hung in the air, a reminder of just how close they'd come to losing everything. Hard to believe it's still standing, Mira said, more to herself than anyone else. William, who'd insisted on tagging along, nodded. And harder to believe we're the ones who saved it. Mira arched an eyebrow. You sound surprised. Let's just say I've learned not to underestimate you, William replied, managing a small smile. Good, Mira said, her tone firm, because this was just the beginning. We've got work to do, and I'm not about to let anyone forget how close we came to losing it all. William nodded, his gaze following a group of workers as they hauled debris away. You think people will remember? They'll remember, Mira replied, her voice carrying the weight of the past few days. People never forget when you save their asses. As the sun set over the ruins, casting long shadows that danced like specters of battles past, Mira and William stood in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The archive would be rebuilt piece by piece, but the scars of the battle would remain, a reminder of what was lost and what was saved. Back in space, the Defiant drifted toward Earth, its crew pulling together to patch up the ship, much like they'd patched themselves up after the battle. They'd get by, just like they always did, with a bit of duct tape, determination, and a healthy dose of sarcasm. In the small galley, Drax and Lox worked over the navigation console, bits and pieces spread out like a mechanic's puzzle. Think we'll get her running again? Lox asked, his voice carrying a note of hope. If she doesn't explode first, Drax replied, though there was no bite in his words, just the familiar banter of comrades who'd seen too much. Ven watched them from the doorway, arms folded across his chest. Think we'll ever get a break? He asked, not really expecting an answer. Lox chuckled, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. Not likely, Cap. But hey, at least we'll never be bored, you sure about that? Drax quipped, tightening a bolt with a twist that suggested he'd done this 100 times before. I hear retirement's a killer. The three of them shared a grin, each knowing that retirement wasn't in the cards anytime soon. They were survivors, fighters, and maybe a little bit insane, not that they'd admit it. Back on the bridge, Ven sat in the captain's chair, staring out at the stars. We did good, he said softly, though the words were meant more for himself than anyone else. Mira joined him, taking a seat nearby. We did, she agreed, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd fought hard and come out the other side. Think the galaxy will ever change? Ven asked, a hint of wistfulness in his tone. Mira considered the question, her eyes fixed on the stars. Maybe not, she said finally, but we can change the way we deal with it. Ven nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Guess that's something. As the Defiant continued its journey back to Earth, the crew settled into the familiar rhythm of life aboard a barely functioning spaceship. Repairs would be made, wounds would heal, and they'd move on to the next challenge, whatever that might be. For now, they'd celebrate their victory, however fleeting, and look forward to whatever the future might hold. Because if there was one thing they'd learned, it was that the human spirit was as resilient as it was defiant, and that was something worth fighting for. In the quiet of the aftermath, the crew of the Defiant found solace in their shared silence, each knowing that they'd face the darkness and come out stronger for it. And the galaxy would keep spinning as it always had, with the Defiant and her crew ready for whatever came next. Because sometimes, defiance was all you had, and sometimes that was enough.